Good evening. Tonight, we will quietly step into the long corridors of a royal palace where sorrow echoes louder than the coronation trumpets, and where wooden cradles, never rocked, have fallen silent forever. You might not remember Queen Anne very well. She wasn't as illustrious as Elizabeth I, nor as prominent as Victoria. Her name is often overlooked like a footnote at the bottom of England's history. But if you look closely, she was the one who changed everything. She was the last monarch of the House of Stuart, and the first queen to reign over a newly named nation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain. But behind that crown was a quietly broken woman. Her body betrayed her again and again. 17 pregnancies, 17 hopes, followed by 17 heartbreaks. Some children were born dead. Some lived but never grew. One touched the throne but never reached adulthood. And amid all that loss, she continued to reign. She continued to make decisions. She continued to stand among men in robes and swords, as if pain didn't bleed. They said she was fragile. They said she was dull. They forgot that she achieved what centuries of kings before her could not, uniting two divided nations, England and Scotland, into a single kingdom. So before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly love the stories I'm telling here.
Fortunately, being so pig-headedly Roman Catholic.
And if you're listening from anywhere in the world, let me know. What time is it where you are? What does the sky outside your window look like? Are you listening from New York? From Tokyo? Or a small room in London? In the middle of a rainy night? Wherever you are, now dim the lights. Turn on a soft fan or let a gentle background sound play, and come with me into tonight's story. Anne was born on the 6th of February at St. James's Palace in London, as the second daughter of James, Duke of York, later King James II, and Anne Hyde, a woman of non-noble birth. Anne was never expected to ascend the throne. At that time, only sons were truly considered legitimate heirs. Daughters, especially second daughters, were often forgotten in discussions of succession. From an early age, Anne was frail. She suffered from severe conjunctivitis, an illness that left her eyes red and blurred, leading to her being sent to the Netherlands for treatment at the age of 4. For many years, Anne lived apart from her family, learning to endure loneliness in a foreign land where no one called her name in her mother's voice. When she returned to England, Anne was about 10 years old, and already a shy, introspective girl. Her sister Mary, beautiful, lively, and expected to marry a prince to forge alliances for England, stood in stark contrast. Anne was quiet, often sitting by windows, reading the Bible or embroidering. But during that period, her life took an unexpected turn. A young girl named Sarah Jennings, born in 1660, was admitted as a maid at court. Sarah was a few years older than Anne, but quickly drew attention with her tall frame, bright eyes, and sharp, ambitious mind. Sarah didn't come from a wealthy family, but she knew how to make herself indispensable. Anne and Sarah met when Anne was about 13. At first, it was just helping with shawls, bringing tea, changing dresses. But those brief conversations became the most treasured part of Anne's day. Sarah didn't speak timidly like the other maids. She dared to ask Anne's opinions, to tease her, and even gave her a personal nickname, Mrs. Morley. In return, Anne called Sarah Mrs. Freeman. These odd titles, peculiar for aristocracy, were symbols of equality, a space where Anne was not a princess, and Sarah was not a servant. They began writing to each other not political letters, but notes filled with longing, joys, and even petty jealousy when one seemed to spend more time with someone else. Anne, a girl raised in isolation for the first time in her life, felt something deeper than all courtly rituals, a true friendship. As Anne approached adulthood, the pressure to marry weighed heavily on her. In 1683, she married Prince George of Denmark, a kind man. Not very bright, but loyal and unproblematic. This marriage, though not romantic, was built on respect. George didn't interfere in politics and remained by Anne's side through every hardship. Yet fate did not spare Anne. She began a series of tragic pregnancies, a total of 17, but only one child, William. Duke of Gloucester, survived past infancy. Even he was frail and died at the age of 11. Each miscarriage, each empty cradle, each small funeral in royal chapels left Anne with a wound that could never heal. Through all of this, Sarah remained by her side. She washed Anne's handkerchiefs when she cried. She cleaned the room after the doctors left. She was the only one who dared to say, "You still have me." Their bond was so deep that people began to gossip. Some said it was friendship. Others believed it crossed ordinary boundaries. But regardless, Sarah became irreplaceable in Anne's life. When King James II, Anne's father, was overthrown during the Glorious Revolution in 1688, Anne faced a difficult choice: support her exiled father or recognize her sister Mary and brother-in-law William of Orange as the new sovereigns. After many sleepless nights, Anne chose to support her sister not for politics, but for religious conviction and her own future. That decision severed her relationship with her father, but it was also the decision that placed Anne next in line for the throne. From a forgotten girl, from a weak younger sister, Anne became the only legitimate heir after the death of Mary, who had no children, and the early death of William, Anne's only son. And beside Anne, like a loyal and fiery shadow, remained Sarah Churchill, the only woman who still called her Mrs. Morley, even when all others bowed and said, "Your Majesty." In 1702, when King William III died from a horse-riding accident, Anne the Princess, no one thought of, officially ascended the throne. She took the English crown at age 37. With a frail body, a heart full of loss, but a spirit not as weak as many believed, Anne was not trained to rule like male monarchs. She didn't deliver grand speeches or ride into battle like Elizabeth I once had, but Anne possessed something few in the court truly had: a genuine sense of duty not to wield power for herself, but to keep peace in the land. From the start of her reign, Anne stood between two powerful political forces, the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs represented merchants, cities, and liberal ideas. The Tories stood for the aristocracy, landowners, conservatism, and support for the Church of England. Anne, with deep loyalty to the church and country, leaned toward the Tories, but she had to maintain a delicate balance to prevent political civil war. The War of the Spanish Succession broke out the same year she ascended the throne. Europe was shaken by the threat of France and Spain, two Catholic powers uniting under a single crown. England, fearing encirclement, was forced into a long and costly war. Though she disliked warfare, Anne supported it for the greater cause. She believed, "I am a woman, physically weak, but an Englishwoman with a loyal and resolute heart." She entrusted the battlefield to John Churchill, Sarah's husband, and he delivered glorious victories, most notably at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. But these very triumphs made the Whigs increasingly arrogant, demanding more and pressuring Anne to cut off Tory influence. Meanwhile, public sentiment was shifting. People were weary of high taxes and sons not returning from war. The Tories, with the slogan "Peace, Church, and the King," gradually regained favor, and Anne saw the moment to act. Step by step, she removed Whig ministers, reduced Churchill's power, and brought loyalists into office, particularly Robert Harley. who led numerous financial reforms to ease the burdens of war. Strangely, throughout all of this, Anne was still called a weak queen, but it was she who maneuvered the court with steadfast silence. She didn't shout like male rulers, didn't need to wave swords to command. She used persistence, patriotism, and the wisdom to know when to endure and when to strike. During her reign, the nation not only won great victories in Europe, but also achieved one of the most pivotal turning points in history, the union of England and Scotland. At the start of the 18th century, what we now know as the United Kingdom didn't yet exist. Instead, there were two separate kingdoms, the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland, united under one monarch, since James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, but still with separate parliaments, laws, and churches. However, the relationship between these sibling nations was far from peaceful. Historical hatred, border conflicts, and especially religious differences had doomed all previous efforts at union. And yet, during the reign of a woman suffering from chronic gout, often carried on a sedan chair, a miracle occurred. The driving force behind the act of union was not just political ambition, but also anxiety over succession. Queen Anne had lost all 17 of her children either in infancy or early childhood, with the Stuart line nearing its end. English nobles feared Scotland might choose a different monarch, possibly a Catholic descendant of the Stuarts, which would split the realm and potentially spark war. Conservative leaders in England proposed a solution. If we cannot produce a shared heir, let us create a shared nation. Thus, tense negotiations began. The English Parliament wanted union to gain full control. The Scottish Parliament feared loss of sovereignty, but at that time, Scotland was in the midst of an economic crisis following the failure of the Darien Scheme, a colonial attempt in Panama. They needed financial support. England needed allegiance. Anne's government, guided by the shrewd Robert Harley and by Anne herself, who closely followed each development despite her declining health, presented an attractive offer. If Scotland agreed to unite, England would pay its debts and open up commercial opportunities within the empire. After many heated votes, the Act of Union was finally signed in 1707, creating a new country, the Kingdom of Great Britain. For the first time, Scotland and England shared a single parliament at Westminster, a common flag, the Union Jack, and a unified political future. Anne became the first Queen of Great Britain. Yet curiously, though her name is recorded in history as the unifier of two nations, Anne never celebrated, nor boasted. In her diaries and letters, she rarely mentioned the union as a personal triumph. Perhaps she understood. It was necessary not to build glory, but to prevent collapse. With that spirit, Anne, though frail, childless, and friendless, remained steadfast on the throne, walking step by step with her country's destiny. She did not create legendary triumphs like Elizabeth I, but she left behind something more enduring: stability. After the Act of Union was signed in 1707, forming the Kingdom of Great Britain, a newly unified country between England and Scotland, Anne became the first queen of this united nation. It was a monumental political victory, but unlike the grand images often seen in glorious reigns, that moment happened in the quiet that was so characteristic of her. Anne did not appear on a grand platform to wave at her subjects. She did not deliver a fiery speech about unity. Instead, she observed, listened, signed, and withdrew to her chambers. But do not mistake that silence for weakness, for in that very silence, Anne defined a distinct style of rule: gentle, persistent, yet as weighty as stone. From a certain perspective, Anne was a ruler who didn't fit the mold. She wasn't a natural-born leader. lacked the strategic brilliance of Elizabeth I, and didn't possess the flamboyant personality of Henry VIII. But what made Anne special was that she never tried to be anyone else. She ruled not with a lofty voice, but with quiet devotion, s'il patience, and the deep emotions of a woman who had endured profound loss. When she first came to the throne, many in court underestimated Anne. Afflicted by chronic gout, she often had to be carried in a sedan chair and at times couldn't walk into council meetings on her own. They assumed a woman in such condition would be easily manipulated, easily led by ambitious ministers or political factions. But they were wrong. Anne was never a puppet. On the contrary, she was the one quietly pulling the strings. She didn't meddle deeply in debates, but she always knew when to choose the right person, how to keep them in place, and when to dismiss them. Unter herein. The two main parties, the Whigs and the Tories, battled constantly, but while both sides tried to pull her in, Anne remained at the center, not through political scheming, but through the instinct of someone who truly understood who served the people and who served only themselves. One clear example was when she gradually removed the Whig ministers from government after they became arrogant and overreaching during the war. She didn't cause upheaval, just a few nods, a few quiet decrees and power-shifted hands. But that steadiness did not come from ambition, but from a deep sense of duty. Anne once wrote that she viewed the throne as the burden of service, not as an honor or an opportunity for display. She diligently read every document, followed every cabinet meeting, and remained deeply connected to the Church of England as the spiritual foundation of the nation. She resisted efforts to relax laws against Catholics, not out of hatred, but because she believed England needed religious unity to avoid division. Throughout her 12-year reign, Anne did not miss a single important meeting. Despite pain and exhaustion, she was present, and though she rarely appeared in public, the people held a deep affection for her because they knew that behind the palace doors, their queen was truly working. Anne's style of rule was not marked by sweeping reforms like her successors, but she left behind an invaluable legacy: stability. While Europe was undergoing massive upheavals, wars of succession, religious riots, and bloody coups, England under Anne maintained an astonishing balance. She steered the nation through the storm of European war, internal crises, and even ethnic tension between the English and the Scots. She did not build an empire. She did not enact history-changing laws, but she kept the country from collapsing. And sometimes, that is the greatest kind of rule, not to create greatness, but to preserve what exists. Another precious truth is this: Anne ruled with her heart, but never let her heart override her reason. She once wept over Sarah Churchill's betrayal, cried over her inability to produce an heir, and wrote in her diary that she felt God had turned his back on her. But not once did she let those emotions cloud her judgment for the nation. On the contrary, those very feelings made her more understanding, more compassionate toward the people, and more forgiving. Today, when Queen Anne is mentioned, many still see her as a dim figure in history, a sickly queen, childless, and without resounding accomplishments. But if we look closer, we find a unique model of rulership. A woman who didn't need absolute power to lead, didn't need swords to govern, only loyalty, patience, and quiet strength. And perhaps it is that very silence that echoes the longest after she left this world. The greatest tragedy in Anne's life, and the one that haunted her until her final days, was the loss of children who never had the chance to grow up. Anne was pregnant 17 times in her life. 7 miscarriages, 5 prématurées births. Many children died within months of being born. Only one child, William, Duke of Gloucester, lived to the age of 11, then died of a fever, and after that, there was no one. Each passing year extinguished another ray of hope, Each pregnancy brought quiet anticipation of a miracle, yet not once did Anne hear the footsteps of a child running through the palace halls. No air, no voice calling mother, no innocent eyes to entrust with the softest part of her heart. Only small graves, letters never written, and a throne growing colder by the day. In that pain, the only one who stayed beside Anne was not an advisor or general but her husband, Prince George of Denmark. George was not an extraordinary man. He was quiet, not sharp, and had little influence in court. But he was patient, gentle, and never left Anne's side. No matter her illness, her infertility, or the way the court viewed him as a shadow next to the crown. When Anne went into labor, George stood outside the birthing chamber. When she fell ill, he sat by her bed. Theirs was not a passionate love out of poetry, but a bond of resilience and meaning. Once, in a letter to a friend, Anne wrote, "I do not need a prince. I need someone who stays when I have no one." And George was that someone. However, if George was her quiet refuge, then Sarah Churchill, Anne's dearest friend, was the one who left the deepest wound. Sarah was intelligent, sharp, strong-willed, and someone Anne adored, even trusted enough to erase all formalities between them. In their letters, Anne called herself Mrs. Morley, and Sarah Mrs. Freeman, like two close friends. No throne, no court dress, no one above the other. But as Sarah increasingly interfered in court and began to see herself as having control over Anne, the relationship began to fracture. The breaking point came when Sarah accused Anne of having a romantic relationship with a maid, Abigail Hill, for someone who had lived a life of isolation, had been broken by the loss of children and a husband. Losing her closest friend meant losing the final key to her heart. Anne did not rage. She simply ended the friendship quietly, and from that point on, no one was ever close enough to hurt her again. In the days that followed, Anne lived more inwardly, saw fewer people, and grew increasingly silent. But one thing never left her: faith. Despite all the suffering, Anne never complained to God. On the contrary, she prayed every night, read the Bible each morning, and held on to the belief that everything happened for a reason. In a private letter, she once wrote, "If this pain helps me understand what my people have lost in war, then I shall carry it for the rest of my life." Perhaps it was that faith, quiet but enduring, that carried Anne through everything: the loss of children, the loss of her husband, the loss of friendship, and the loneliness that lingered through the end of her life. After years of physical and emotional pain, in the final decade of her life, Queen Anne became a shadow within her own palace. No longer the lively council meetings, no longer the heavy steps between lines of solemn guards, only silent rooms, heavy velvet curtains, and an aging woman sitting alone in the flickering quiet of candlelight. She had once unified two kingdoms, once held a name that both the Tories and Whigs tread carefully around. But in her later years, as her health declined, Anne's influence slowly faded. Her gout worsened, her legs swollen, unable to stand long, unable to eat without help, unable to write without trembling. Servants had to lift her into bed each night, massage her aching legs each morning, and feed her spoonfuls of porridge in silence. Even so, Anne never allowed herself to become an emotional burden. She endured, as she had all her life, with a resolve almost religious in nature. This is my portion, and I shall live to the last day with all my loyalty. In 1714, as Anne turned 49, far older than most at the time, she no longer had anyone truly close by her side. Her husband, Prince George, had died in 1708. His death was a deep fracture, for although he was never prominent, his quiet presence had been the firmest support in Anne's world. After George's death, she did not remarry, did not seek new companionship. She lived with memories, with unsent letters, and with portraits no heir would inherit. Sarah Churchill had long since left the palace. The servants around her changed constantly, and Abigail Hill, the last friend Anne once trusted, could no longer fill the emptiness. It's said that one evening that year, Anne asked her doctor, "Do you think anyone will remember me when I die?" And no one could answer. On the 30th of July, 1714, the Queen fell gravely ill. She suffered a minor stroke, followed by prolonged fevers and gradual paralysis. Efforts were made to keep it secret, but the entire court knew the Queen was dying. No children sat by her bedside. No prince held her hand one last time. No true loved one whispered a farewell. Those present were ministers, doctors, and a few maids standing silently, waiting for the final moment, like a royal ritual, not a personal sorrow. On the morning of the 1st of August, 1714, Anne breathed her last. She passed in silence, no tears, no cries, no farewell song beyond the obligatory rites of royalty. She died at 49. After 12 years on the throne, leaving behind an empty crown and a nation awaiting its next heir, her death caused no great upheaval. There was no national mourning with weeping crowds as in Elizabeth I's time. No monument was raised at once. The court swiftly transferred the crown to a distant relative, George I of the House of Hanover, a German who didn't speak English. And just like that, she was placed into a quiet page of history, labeled the sickly queen, the childless one, the pause between two great eras. Few historians have called her great. She had no famous military victory. No invention bore her name, and she left no heirs to carry her legacy. But was that truly a failure? No. Anne was the one who kept the nation from breaking when war knocked at the door. The one who united two peoples who had once been enemies. The one who bore no child and yet left behind a country that other children could call home. She did not need to be glorified, for her greatness lay in her quietness, living humbly, reigning patiently, and dying peacefully. It is a kind of greatness only the truly strong can achieve. After Queen Anne drew her final breath on the 1st of August, 1714, in the quiet chamber of Kensington Palace, England entered a new era. The age of the House of Hanover and Anne's name slowly faded into the muted pages of history. There was no funeral that stirred the hearts of the people, as in the time of Elizabeth I. No grand monument, erected instantly in her honor. The funeral was conducted with proper royal ceremony, but lacking emotional depth. She departed in silence just as she had lived, ruled, and endured. No fanfare, no tears, no one weeping with true sorrow. And perhaps that is why many believed she left nothing behind. But that is not true, because Anne's legacy, though quiet, is more enduring than anything visible to the eye. The first and greatest thing she left behind was the creation of the Kingdom of Great Britain, established through the Act of Union in 1707. Before that, England and Scotland were two separate countries, sharing a monarch but divided in law, parliament, and loyalty. Through Anne's diplomacy, patience, and reconciliatory spirit, two formerly warring peoples were united under one flag, one parliament, one name, not by the sword, but by persuasion, not through bloodshed, but through soft politics. Without that foundation, the mighty British Empire that followed might have remained just a fragile idea, never realized. Beyond unifying two kingdoms, Anne steered the nation through deep political division. The Whigs wanted progress, and expanded warfare for commercial gain. The Tories sought to preserve tradition and avoid conflict. Anne did not align completely with either. She didn't speak much, but she observed closely. She didn't impose, but she knew when to sever ties. Thanks to her firm, silent resolve, England did not descend into chaos, nor fracture under partisan warfare. She may not have created new policies, but she kept the system from collapsing. She may not have led from the front, but she kept the flame alive. Anne was also one of the rare reigning queens of the time who did not attempt to hide her fragility. She did not adopt a masculine image to prove her strength, did not force herself into being a man in a skirt as some queens before had done. Anne was a woman from how she loved her husband, grieved her children, feared betrayal, to the genuine tears she shed behind palace curtains. But the astonishing thing is, though she lived with all the vulnerability of a woman, she still bore an entire kingdom on her shoulders. Without shouting or conquering, Anne proved that a queen could lead with compassion, intuition, and resilience through loss. It was a quiet, powerful declaration of womanhood, long before the world had a word for feminism. Today, some streets in London still bear her name, Queen Anne. Style houses still stand in England and across the ocean. Even a war in America was once named Queen Anne's War. These signs show she was never truly forgotten, only not remembered as she deserved. No statue was raised because she left no bloodline. No plays were written because she sparked no scandal. No dazzling victories. But does greatness always need to dazzle and shine? Or is it sometimes found in the ability to quietly keep the world from breaking? Anne had no children, but she left behind a united country. She had no military victories, but she held domestic peace in her hands. She had no successor, but she left a political structure strong enough to keep moving after her death. No one remembers Anne as a legend, but for those who have looked deeply into history, she always appears as a quiet pillar of an entire era. And if tonight, amid a noisy world, you're lying in bed, listening to her story in the soft glow of a nightlight, then smile gently, because you've just heard about a woman who lived a life not perfect, not glorious, but filled with dignity. A woman who never needed applause, because it was her silence that makes her unforgettable. When Queen Anne drew her final breath, the English throne fell into a void. No child had survived to inherit it. There was no direct heir, no English prince waiting in the palace. And so, the eyes of the entire court were forced to turn far away to a distant, cold land called Hanover. In the former Holy Roman Empire, there, a man lived who spoke no English, had never set foot in London, and shared almost no emotional connection with the English people, but he was the nearest Protestant heir of the Stuart line. His name was George Ludwig, or as history would come to know him, King George I of Great Britain. What happened? Why did the English crown fall into the hands of a German? The answer lies in the Act of Settlement of 1701, a law designed more as a precaution than a desire, fearing that the throne would fall into the hands of the Catholic descendants of the House of Stuart, such as James Francis Edward Stuart, known as the Jacobite Pretender. The English Parliament decided that only Protestant heirs would be eligible for succession, and among a list of over 50 individuals from princes and baronesses to distant continental relatives, the first in line was Sophia of Hanover, granddaughter of James I, and after her death just weeks before Anne's, the right of succession passed to her son, George. Thus, within days of Queen Anne's death, a historic decision was made. George Ludwig, a Duke of Hanover, would become King of Great Britain, not because he was beloved, not because he had ever lived in England, but simply because he was of the correct religion. And so, in September 1714, King George, I set foot in England, bringing with him a German entourage. trunks heavy with documents and maps, and a cold heart, nearly emotionless toward the new country he was about to rule. Were the English welcoming? Not exactly. They were confused, uncertain, and many longed for Queen Anne, a woman who, though frail, spoke their native tongue, shared their grief, and read the Bible in English. George, he needed interpreters to read court documents. He rarely spoke in public, and throughout his reign, he spent more time in Hanover than in London. Yet from this coldness and distance, England entered a period of transformation, no longer led by an all-powerful monarch like Anne. George, due to his lack of cultural understanding, gradually left more authority to the cabinet and parliament. In this way, whether intentionally or not, he became the first monarch to lay the groundwork for a truly constitutional monarchy where the king reigns, but does not rule. The story, after Anne, therefore, is no longer simply the tragedy of a lonely woman. It is the story of a transition between two centuries, two dynasties, two styles of governance, and above all, it marks the beginning of a dynasty that would last over 300 years, the House of Hanover, and later, the House of Windsor, which, to this day, still reigns over Britain through familiar faces, Queen Elizabeth II. Then King Charles III. It all began with a man from Germany, placed on the throne simply because his ancestors were Protestant. When King George I arrived in England in September 1714, he did not bring with him the heart of an heir to the kingdom. Instead, he came as someone appointed through legal procedure, almost reluctantly, coldly, and entirely unfamiliar with the country he was about to rule. George Ludwig, born in Hanover, a small duchy in the Holy Roman Empire, was a German noble who loved hunting, white sausages, dark beer, and held little affection for England. He did not speak English. He did not read the Bible in English, and he had no emotional connection to the culture of the misty island nation. When he stepped off the ship in Greenwich, he was not greeted with applause, but with wary stares and even indifference. The English people had just lost a native Queen Anne, someone who, though ailing, they still saw as one of us. George, with his stern face, dry gaze, and German-speaking entourage, only deepened the sense that the nation was now being ruled by a stranger. And yet, that very distance ushered in a major institutional turning point for England. George I ascended the throne in a time of instability. Supporters of the House of Stuart, known as the Jacobite movement, began to rise in Scotland and northern England, hoping to restore the true king, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Catholic son of James II. But George, as an experienced general from the continent, handled the uprisings effectively and decisively, not through brutality, but through a combination of military strategy and political maneuvering. However, what made George I's reign truly distinctive was not found in his battles, but in his absence. George I spent most of his time in Hanover, where he felt more at ease. In London, he had no friends, no social life, and the dull court ceremonies only made him want to escape. He didn't even dine with his courtiers, a practice that had been a key part of English political life. Yet this reluctance to rule unintentionally became a constitutional turning point, because he did not directly manage the government. George I gradually allowed executive power to fall into the hands of his ministers, especially Robert Walpole, whom posterity would regard as Britain's first prime minister. From that point onward, a new political structure began to emerge. The king reigned ceremonially, while Parliament and the government held real power. George never intended this, but thanks to him, Britain officially entered the era of true constitutional monarchy. The king was no longer the center of power, but a national symbol, In terms of his personal life, George, I left little fondness behind. He married Sophia Dorothea of Celle, but their marriage was a disaster. After suspecting her of adultery, George imprisoned her for 30 years in a secluded castle in Germany and never saw her again. He had many mistresses, most notably 2 German sisters named Melusine and Erengard. The English mocked them with nicknames Maypole and Elephant, because one was tall and thin, and the other very large. George also failed to form a close bond with his own children, particularly Crown Prince George Augustus, who would later become George II. Father and son disliked each other, quarreled constantly, and even went years without speaking. Looking at George I's reign, one sees a cold, detached king with no clear love for England, but on closer inspection, it was precisely this non-interference, this standing aside, that helped shape a stable political system for the century that followed. When George I died in 1727, he was on his way back to Hanover, true to the distant nature of his entire life. He died in Osnabrück, Germany, not in England. His funeral in London was quiet and emotionally sparse. But what he left behind was not affection. It was a new structure of power. From that point on, English monarchs were no longer the final decision makers. Instead, they became figureheads, while true authority shifted to Parliament and the cabinet. And it was from the time of George I that the role of the Prime Minister, the one who governs in place of the king, began to clearly take shape. A king who did not love England. A king who did not speak English. A king who did not live in England much. But a king who helped lead England into an entirely new era. When George I died, the English crown passed to his son George Augustus, who was then 44 years old. Thus, he became King George II of Great Britain. George II at the throne with a complicated mindset. Throughout his life, he had been estranged from his father, even banished from court over disagreements on politics, ceremony, and even the naming of his own son. For years, George II viewed his father as authoritarian and distant. Now, as he took the throne himself, people wondered, would he become a repeat of his father or something entirely new? The answer is a bit of both. George II shared many traits with his father. He was born in Germany, spoke German more fluently than English, and frequently visited Hanover. But he also possessed distinct qualities, most notably a military spirit. George II was the last British monarch to personally lead troops into battle. At the Battle of Dettingen in 1743, a victory for the Anglo-Austrian alliance during the War of the Austrian Succession. Though not a military genius, the image of George II on horseback, sword drawn, among soldiers, shouting, "God save the King," made him the final symbol of the warrior, king era. After him, no British monarch would step onto the battlefield again. From George III onward, the king would stand behind the government, no longer fighting, no longer wearing armor. But war is not just about imagery. Under the reign of George II, Britain entered the first truly global conflict in modern history, the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763. This was a massive confrontation stretching from Europe to North America, India, the Caribbean, and distant colonial territories. It was the precursor to the concept of a world war. As never before had a conflict played out simultaneously across so many continents. Britain and France were the principal rivals battling for control over colonies, maritime trade, and global military influence. Under the leadership of William Pitt the Elder, one of the first truly powerful prime ministers, Britain began to expand its colonial reach aggressively, particularly in India and Canada. Though George II was not directly involved in the management of military campaigns, He was the monarch during Britain's decisive emergence as a global empire. By the time the war ended in 1763, 3 after his death, Britain had gained most of France's colonial possessions in North America and India, marking the beginning of what would become the British Empire proper. In his private life, George II was strikingly different from his cold and distant father. He was deeply attached to his wife Caroline of Ansbach, a sharp and intelligent woman beloved by the public. They were a respected couple, not perfect, but sincere. Caroline was not only queen consort, but also the king's quiet advisor. When she died in 1737, George II was devastated. It is said that, upon visiting her coffin, he whispered, "No one will ever believe how much I loved you." Though hot-tempered, George II was remarkably loyal. He never remarried, and though he had a few mistresses afterward, none ever replaced Caroline in his heart. Perhaps in his pride, temper, and stubbornness, he remained a devoted man, a trait not always found in monarchs. However, like his father before him, George II had a terrible relationship with his son Frederick, Prince of Wales. The two constantly argued, to the point that George II forbade Frederick from visiting the palace. They clashed over everything: religion, politics, and even how to educate the royal grandchildren. Tragedy repeated itself. Frederick died before his father, at age 44, from illness. Thus, when George II died in 1760, the crown passed not to his son, but to his grandson George III, then only 22 years old. And so, a new chapter began with a young king, born in England, fluent in English, and about to face an unprecedented upheaval: the American War of Independence. As for George II, he died on the 25th of October, 1760, at the age of 76, the first monarch to be buried in the new royal vault at Windsor. Beside his beloved wife, he was not a reformer, not a philosopher, but he was the last king to ride into battle, the overseer of Britain's first imperial expansion, and the bridge between two eras, from a European kingdom to a global empire. George III ascended the throne in 1760 at the age of 22, following the death of his grandfather, King George II. Unlike his two predecessors who had come from distant Germany, George III was born, raised, and entirely educated on English soil. Upon his coronation, he made a statement that moved the nation. Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain. It was more than a political declaration, it was a proclamation of identity. After two German-speaking kings, who lived apart from their subjects and spent more time in Hanover than in London, George III was a breath of fresh air. He was intelligent, composed, diligent, and most notably without mistresses. Throughout his life, he loved only one woman, Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, with whom he had 15 children. In the early years of his reign, George III showed a clear desire to be a moral, compassionate, and people-centered monarch. He would walk through the city without guards, personally read his children's textbooks, and was even criticized by courtiers for being too modest. To him, a king should not just be a symbol but a living example. And in the eyes of many Britons, George III truly was the good king in every sense. Yet history would not grant him a peaceful reign. The greatest catastrophe of George III's reign was the loss of the 13 American colonies, an event history would call the American Revolution, 1775-1783. At first, George III did not want war. He merely wanted to maintain the legal right to tax the colonies, which he saw as necessary to offset the costs of the previous war with France. But his government, and especially Parliament, imposed heavy tax laws from the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act to the Tea Act, making American colonists feel oppressed, exploited, and unrepresented. When the Americans began to protest, and then to revolt, George III chose to side with the supreme authority of the crown, and in doing so, became the image of tyranny in the eyes of the revolutionaries. In 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia, George III was explicitly named a tyrant, and from being a moral king, he became a despot in the eyes of half the world. The British Empire, once mighty, was for the first time defeated on a massive scale by those who had once been loyal subjects. And when the United States gained independence, it wasn't just land that was lost. The very image of the British monarchy collapsed across the Atlantic. George III was heartbroken, but not bitter. When news of America's victory was confirmed, he quietly said, "I tried to do what was right, but if they no longer wish me to rule, I have no reason to remain with them." After America, it was his own mind that left him. Starting in the 1782nd, George III began showing signs of mental illness. He would speak to himself for hours, write incoherent letters, and at times believed himself to be the reincarnation of King Nebuchadnezzar. Today, doctors suspect he suffered from porphyria, a metabolic disorder that affects the nervous system, but at the time, he was simply thought to be going mad. During the years 1788–1789, George III had to be isolated and was often restrained with leather straps to prevent him from harming himself. There were days he sat for hours at the window, whispering to the dead. Some mornings, he called out to Charlotte, his beloved wife, though she was long gone. By the end of his life, he had lost all sight, hearing, and ability to communicate, living like a lost soul in the eternal darkness of his own mind, unable to continue ruling. His son, Prince George, was appointed Prince Regent in 1811, and so, while George III still lived, the crown had already left his hands. But the tragedy of George III was not only the loss of America, or of his intellect, or his power. It was the absolute loneliness within his own palace. He who once read books to his children every night, he who once rode horseback among commoners in the fields, he who once said, "I wish to be king, but first I must be a good man," now sat alone in a locked room, blind, deaf, and unable to remember who anyone was. When he died in 1820, at the age of 81, a ceremonial royal funeral was held, but the public had long grown accustomed to the image of a mad king in isolation. They pitied him, but could not help seeing him as a symbol of collapse. Yet George III was not a failure. Though he lost America, he helped Britain hold on to the rest of its empire. Though he lost his mind, he never lost his dignity. Though rejected by the Americans, he was the first monarch to truly love England with all his heart. Above all, he paved the way for major institutional reforms: the rise of the cabinet, a more independent parliament, and the gradual shift from absolute monarchy to a stable constitutional system. George III was a king too good for a time too harsh. When George IV officially ascended the throne in 1820, he had already ruled Britain in name for 9 years as Prince Regent, standing in for his father George III during the monarch's final mad years. By middle age, George IV was no longer the charming young prince of his 20s, but an overweight, alcoholic, depressed man who despised responsibility. Yet, in contrast to his physical decline, he possessed an extraordinary eye for beauty, and an unrelenting passion for all things elegant. From a young age, George was known for his lavish lifestyle. He was the first in Europe to elevate men's fashion to an art form with tailored suits, silk robes, feathered top hats, and gleaming Italian leather shoes. An entire generation of aristocrats copied his dress, and London at the time was dubbed the capital of elegance. Oh, he was also the greatest patron of the arts in the Hanoverian dynasty. Under his reign, Carlton House became a cultural center. The Brighton Pavilion, with its fusion of Indian, Chinese, and Rococo architecture, was built like a dream in the heart of England. He adored Rubens' paintings, Nash's architecture, and the French interiors of Louis XV. No British king before him had dared to turn royal residences into surreal works of art like he did. But all of it was built on borrowed money. George IV spent recklessly. He used public funds to build palaces, buy private collections, and host multi-day banquets with fireworks, champagne, and entire orange groves shipped from Spain, to the point that the government had to issue special acts on 3 occasions just to erase the king's debts. The British public, already under tax pressure after the war with France, began to resent him. To them, George IV was not a king, but a playboy in royal robes. His personal life was no less scandalous. George married Princess Caroline of Brunswick, but after exactly 1 wedding night, he declared he never wanted to see her again. The marriage was purely political, with no affection involved. In fact, on the wedding day, he was so drunk he couldn't stand. The couple lived separately for years. When George became king, he banned Caroline from attending the coronation. She was pushed out of the court, slandered, spied upon, and eventually died in disgrace. Public opinion was fiercely divided. Some sympathized with Caroline, others supported the king. But regardless of who won, the monarchy lost its dignity in the eyes of the people. This was a time when the crown was no longer a symbol of morality, but a headline for the tabloids. Politically, George IV had no real capability. He hated cabinet meetings, had no interest in colonial policy, and often delegated everything to the Prime Minister, especially Lord Liverpool, who almost single-handedly steered the country through the difficult post-Napoleonic period. Yet, during his chaotic reign, a silent revolution began. The birth of the Reform movement. The British public, fed up with decadent kings and privileged nobles, began demanding wider voting rights, social justice, and cuts to religious privilege. And while George IV did nothing to promote reform, it was precisely his disconnection from reality that ignited the public's fervor like never before. George IV died in 1830, at the age of 67. In loneliness and despair, his body was so bloated that he could no longer stand on his own. Liver disease and arthritis forced him to use high doses of opium to sleep. Each night was a nightmare of the past: lost lovers, unpaid debts, and curses from the people he no longer dared to hear. When he died, a few mourned him. Some even breathed a sigh of relief. He once dreamed of becoming the Louis XIV of England, the Sun King, a lover of beauty, a leader of culture. But in the end, he left behind a nation full of contradictions, a shaky throne, and a memory that blended grandeur with absurdity. When George IV died in 1830, Britain hesitated to look toward the only remaining heir of the House of Hanover, William, Duke of Clarence, younger brother of the late king, then already 64 years old. To many, William didn't look like a king. Most of his life had been spent in the Royal Navy. He lived simply, disliked elaborate ceremony, and once bluntly said, "I never thought I'd wear the crown, and I have no interest in it." And that wasn't humility, it was honesty. William was the third son of George III. He wasn't trained to rule, lacked political skills, wasn't as educated as his brothers, and had nearly resigned himself to a life of sea-bound pleasures. He had a long relationship of over 20 years with actress Dorothy Jordan, with whom he had 10 illegitimate children, the Fitzclarences, whom he loved and cared for deeply. Only when his elder brothers died without legitimate heirs was William considered the next lawful successor, and thus, an aging, plain-spoken naval officer suddenly became King William IV of Great Britain. From the moment he ascended the throne, William surprised many. No extravagance, no pomp, no elaborate ceremonies like his brother. He cut the royal budget, declined costly rituals, and even opened the doors himself to greet guests at Windsor Castle, leaving many courtiers bewildered. The public affectionately called him the Sailor King, a tribute to the elderly man who spoke plainly, dressed simply, and strolled like an ordinary person. He gestured wildly when speaking, enjoyed recounting old naval tales, and was somewhat clumsy in political matters. But that very clumsiness made people feel close to him after a reign riddled with scandal and spectacle. Yet that closeness could not stop the political storm awaiting him. The 1832 were a turbulent time in Britain, inspired by the French and American revolutions. The middle and working classes began demanding electoral reform, expanded representation, and an end to rotten boroughs. Electoral districts with no real population, but still had seats in Parliament. At this moment, the reform movement of 1832 began rising, strongly backed by Prime Minister Charles Grey, leader of the Whig Party. William IV, who disliked political factions, was initially hesitant, fearing that sweeping reforms might lead to unrest, like in France. However, as protests grew, he realized if change didn't happen, the crown might be swept away. And then, he did the unexpected, supported the Reform Act of 1832. He dissolved the stubborn House of Lords, approved adding representatives for new industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham, and officially abolished dozens of rotten boroughs that existed only on paper. For the first time in history, voting rights were expanded to the middle class, no longer reserved solely for the landed aristocracy. Though the reforms were limited, still excluding the working class, it was the first milestone in Britain's path to modern democracy. And William IV, who barely understood politics, was the brave king who embraced change. In his personal life, William lived with almost bizarre simplicity. He didn't restore lavish court rituals. There were no Versailles-style banquets, no artistic passions like his brothers. He liked wearing naval uniforms, drinking light wine, and strolling alone in royal gardens without guards. When courtiers complained he lacked the majesty of a king, William simply laughed. "Then you wear the red robes and parade about, I'll stick to my shirt." The people loved him, not because he was great, but because he was the last kind man on the throne. William IV died in 1837 at the age of 71, leaving no legitimate heir. And so, the crown passed to his 18-year-old niece, Princess Alexandrina Victoria, as if by a miraculous design of history. Just as an era of old, conservative men came to a close. A new age of youth, strength, and brilliance was about to be born. The Victorian era. On June 20, 1837, at Kensington Palace. When Victoria was only 18, a court official entered her room and knelt down. "Your Majesty, King William has passed away." Victoria, still in her nightgown, sat in silence. She did not cry. She did not panic. She only asked one question. "Ami, qui now?" And from that morning on, the petite girl, barely 5 feet tall, with a soft voice and radiant eyes, became Queen Victoria of Great Britain. She was the last of the Hanover line and the first of a new era, an era that would bear her name, the Victorian Age. Victoria was not thoroughly prepared for the throne, but she possessed a steely will and unwavering heart from a young age. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, controlled her with strict discipline, enforcing what was known as the Kensington system to isolate her from the outside world. She lived under rigid rules, no friends, no play, constantly monitored even in sleep, and forced to hold her mother's hand all day throughout the palace. Perhaps because of this, the first thing Victoria did upon becoming queen was ban her mother from the royal bedchamber, not out of hatred, but because she understood a queen could not be bound by anyone, not even maternal love. Though young, Victoria was not naive. She had sharp insight, understood the weight of her responsibilities, and surprisingly displayed the political caution of someone far older. In her early years, she was mentored by Prime Minister Lord Melbourne, almost like a spiritual father who taught her how to engage with Parliament, how to sign documents, and how to maintain composure in meetings. The British public, initially hesitant about a young woman ascending the throne, gradually grew fond of Victoria for her simplicity, dignity, and dedication. She didn't show off. She didn't overdo it, but in every step, every speech, there was a quiet confidence that inspired trust. Then a man entered her life and forever changed the heart of the young queen, Prince Albert of Saxe, Coburg and Gotha. Albert was a distant cousin on her mother's side, a calm, studious, and incredibly principled young German man. Victoria fell in love with him almost from their first meeting. Unlike most royal marriages, Victoria herself proposed. They married in 1840. From then on, Victoria's private life became the model of royal marital devotion. They truly loved one another, wrote letters daily when apart, had 9 children, and together built the image of a moral, orderly, and close-knit royal family, in stark contrast to the scandals of George IV's reign. Albert helped Victoria lay the foundations of culture, science, and education. He was the driving force behind the Great Exhibition of 1851, a magnificent event showcasing Britain's industrial might, with the Crystal Palace of glass and steel standing as a miracle of the age. The 19th century under Victoria's reign marked the unprecedented expansion of the British Empire. Territories in India, Canada, Africa, Southeast Asia, and Australia were successively exploited, conquered, and annexed. Victoria, once a sheltered girl at Kensington, now became queen of 1/3 of the world. In 1876, she was officially titled Empress of India, formalizing a truth. Hers was the empire on which the sun never set. But Victoria was not a queen only for the nobility. She consistently cared about the living conditions of workers, supported educational reforms, and above all became a moral symbol in an unsteady world. Amidst industrial revolutions, wars, and religious upheaval, she remained the image of a faithful wife, devoted mother, and gentle yet firm national matriarch. Yet, as with all royal stories, joy did not last forever. In 1861, Prince Albert died of typhoid fever. Victoria then, in her early 42nd, plunged into nearly a decade of mourning. She wore black for the rest of her life, avoided public events, refrained from speeches, and disappeared from view. People called her the Widow of Windsor. Though she later returned to public life, Victoria's smile never fully returned. Still, she continued to rule, continued to sign decrees, and continued to uphold the throne, a steady figure in an era changing too fast. Queen Victoria died on the 22nd of January, 1901, at the age of 81. After more than 63 years on the throne, the longest reign in British history at the time. Her era witnessed the Industrial Revolution, the expansion of empire, the birth of railroads, telegraphs, photography, and great democratic reforms. She was not a great thinker, nor a warrior, nor a brilliant politician, but she was the most stable soul in a world constantly in flux. And when she lay to rest, the entire nation, even the world, bowed their heads in farewell, not just because she was queen, but because she was the living symbol of an age